Sounds great. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar on groundwater dependent ecosystems, or GDEs, and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, in the Sacramento Valley. This webinar is being hosted by Audubon, TNC, Rohde Environmental Consulting, and Ag Innovations as part of our DWR Technical Assistance Program grant. This program intends to build technical and collaborative capacity to protect ecosystems, communities, and small farmers under SGMA. So there are 3 different groups, and we're all working under this technical assistance program umbrella. Our team is working on the ecosystem side of this program, making sure that GSAs and environmental stakeholders are well equipped to work collaboratively together on protecting GDEs and groundwater sustainability plans, and as well on the ground. After conducting a series of interviews, we decided to host this webinar because we learned that gaps in understanding of SGMA and more broadly, the foundational science on GDEs was still a barrier for locals to engage in the GSP process and other GDE protection efforts. So before we get going, a couple things to note. California Water, I'm sure as many people know, is a circus of acronyms. So we're going to do our best to spell these out as we go. For those who aren't super familiar with SGMA, don't worry. We're going to cover the basics of SGMA in our presentations. In the meantime, we're going to use acronyms like GDE to talk about the ecosystems that are reliant on groundwater. We'll use GSA to refer to the agencies that are responsible for writing plans on how to bring groundwater basins into sustainability. And these plans are referred to as GSPs. As a general rule, we're going to ask that the audience please keep cameras and microphones off throughout the webinar and pop all your questions into the chat. We'll pause for brief Q&A throughout the webinar to answer questions. So in the chat, if you see a question that you would like answered, please go ahead and give that question a thumbs up emoji, and we're going to try to get to those first. For the questions that we can't get to, a member of our team will be answering questions in the chat as they come in. I'd also like to take a minute to orient folks a little more to the program and introduce our team. So first we have Caitrin Chappelle, who is the Associate Director of the California Water Program at TNC. She's overseeing program management of this work, and with our newest team member, Bridget Gibbons, who is the new Groundwater Project Director at TNC. And you might hear us repeat this a few times, but again, the goals of this program are both technical and collaborative. So working on the technical side, we have Nick Murphy, who is the Senior Groundwater Scientist at TNC. He's leading the technical analysis with our GSA partners, who we'll get to hear from a little later in the presentation. On the technical side, we also have Melissa Rohde, who is the principal of Rohde Consulting, LLC. Melissa is working with Nick on the technical analysis, and her research on GDEs really laid the foundation for our work. So we're very excited that you all are going to get to hear from her shortly. My name is Taylor Broadhead, and I'm the Senior Manager of Water Policy for Audubon, California. I'm leading this program's outreach and education efforts with help from our facilitators at Ag Innovations. We have Nicolaya Merling, who is a lead facilitator, and Robert Gold, who is the managing facilitator. And will be helping us keep us on track throughout the webinar. And they'll also be facilitating polls as we go to keep things interactive. The webinar today is going to start off with some background on our outreach efforts and really give you guys a better idea of how this webinar came to be. We're also going to give some more background on the DWR TA program in general. How did this happen and why now? And what all are we aiming to do under this program? And then with that, we're also going to give some relevant background on SGMA before we dive a little deeper into the science with the presentation from Melissa Rohde. And then near the end, I'll go over some next steps for stakeholder engagement before we open it up for some more questions. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about how we got here today and some of the outreach work that was done leading up to this webinar. At a high level, the outreach is really intended to complement the technical analysis that Melissa and Nick are doing with our GSA partners in Vina and Yolo. And while we work on expanding the analysis of GDEs in the GSP, at the same time, we also want to be expanding our understanding of what local environmental stakeholders are seeing as barriers and opportunities to engagement in the GSP process and GDE protections more generally. To accomplish that, we interviewed stakeholders to understand both local and statewide trends in the GSP development process. The challenges and opportunities that were identified in the outreach interviews were used to tailor this webinar and then also design future outreach workshops, which we'll talk a little bit more about at the end. And then at the end of this program, the really ultimate goal here is that we're going to report our findings to DWR on how they can support expanded stakeholder engagement and protection of GDEs in the GSP process moving forward. So throughout this year, we conducted over 30 interviews with stakeholders. We focused on engagement, technical barriers, and local opportunities to protect and manage GDEs on the ground, which is what we would all like to do at the end of the day. Much of this outreach was focused in Yolo, Vina, and Butte, but I did also talk to people statewide to understand what some of the trends and challenges and barriers and opportunities were more broadly. The outreach efforts included interviews that represented perspectives from local environmental organizations, GSP advisory committees and boards, and GSA members themselves, state agencies, local RCDs, water districts, and farmers. And after talking with so many people, many of whom are on the call, it's good to see you all again, I'd like to pause just for a moment and really acknowledge that this is such a massive effort that it's taken to get us all to this place. This year, we're celebrating 10 years of SGMA, and it really is an amazing feat. GSAs did a lot of work, which was really challenging given that they are really such young agencies. And then I also want to point out the many NGOs, consultants, and other stakeholders who also did a lot of work to educate themselves, educate their peers, and stay engaged throughout the process. So we do need more time to really deep dive into the interview data, but I will share some of the preliminary findings that helped shape the webinar. So through the outreach interviews, it was really clear that the lack of more detailed guidance, really specific guidance from DWR on how to assess impacts to GDEs was a barrier to more protections in the GSP overall. Data gaps also made it really challenging to make a super comprehensive plan for protecting all GDEs in an area. And we're going to hear about that a little bit more from Melissa during her presentation. It was also clear that local stakeholders have a lot of knowledge that can help bring this technical analysis into the real world. But knowledge and understanding of SGMA and some of the foundational science around GDEs in general make it difficult for people to stay engaged in these kinds of conversations at the GSA level. And what I'm sure many people on this call already know is that the process is long, it's hard, it's been really frustrating, and people have felt isolated for a range of reasons. But in speaking with different stakeholders, we've had an opportunity to kind of pick this apart and reevaluate the approach to stakeholder engagement and make sure that things are moving forward in a way that is more inclusive. And some opportunities for this are through peer-to-peer learning, conducting more targeted and tailored outreach webinars and workshops like we're doing through this grant, and then also better integrating GDE data into other local planning efforts as well. The GSP is extremely important, but there are also a lot of really interesting and great local planning efforts that are going on where there's a lot of opportunity to make sure these things are aligned. So through the webinar, our goal is to make sure that we're all walking away with a shared understanding of what GDEs are and how they're impacted and why they're important to the region, important to GSAs, landowners and growers, and the environment. We're also hoping that this webinar clarifies the purpose and focus of this GDE project for the Sacramento Valley and how it seeks to build the technical and collaborative capacity to better address GDEs collectively. And finally, our goal is to make sure that we're all left off on better footing for subsequent engagement. So having heard about the science and now understanding what the other questions, ideas, and concerns folks might have related to GDEs, we can all move forward into outreach workshops and other outreach activities. So that all being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I will kick it over to Ag Innovations for our first poll so we can get a sense of who all's here and what your background knowledge is.
Great. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you all. Just a quick reminder to those that are just coming on the call. We've had a number of folks just come in the last few minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will try and address them as we go throughout the webinar. We've got some folks dedicated to addressing those questions. Some of them we will address kind of in the group as well, live. And some will be just addressed via the chat. Others will have to we'll just capture them and try and address them offline, especially more general questions about Sigma. Um, and let's see, what else would I say there is that we would also ask you to refrain from having extended conversations within the chat itself. If you do, please keep those between people rather than a general conversation. And with that said, yeah, we really like to get a sense of who's here and what your familiarity is with Sigma and with GDEs. So we've got 3 questions that we are going to be asking you here about your level of knowledge. And this will help inform the seminar today and future activities. So Nikolai, if you would launch those 3 questions. Okay, because everybody see those? They showing up? Okay, good. I see head nods. Great. So just take a few minutes to answer those questions, and we'll rejoin in a moment. Okay, great. Folks are starting to read them and answer. That's great.
Robert, while people are answering, do you mind if I share my screen and get ready to
Uh, that's great. Yeah. Tee it up.
just to make sure?
Okay, we're making good progress on the poll. We've got almost 50 of 62 of you filling it out, which is great. I think let's take another
Like 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Yes, a full 10 seconds. Okay, please get your answers in quickly.
Okay.
So let's see, we are right there. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. This will give us a good sense who's here.
Hey everybody, I'm the other Ag Innovations team member. My name's Nikolaya. Hopefully you can see these poll results on your screen. Looks like most people are with environmental NGOs or GSAs, which is great. Those are our primary audiences that we're trying to reach today. And that a significant number of people have a good or really good understanding of both GDEs and Sigma. And that some of you, a solid 30%, have been very, very engaged in the process. So that's great for us to know. And as we go forward, we can shape content based on that. And with that, I will pass it over to Caitrin to introduce more about the technical assistance program that we're here as a part of.
Caitrin, are you good with your slides?
Hi, everybody. I'm good with my slides and my notes aren't showing up, so I'm going to wing it, but I'm sure I can handle it. Hi, everybody. I am Caitrin Chappelle. I'm Associate Director of the Nature Conservancy's California Water Program. I'm really excited to be with all of you today, talking to you about California groundwater dependent ecosystems, and Sigma. So I'm just going to share my slides and we will get going. I'm sure many of you are aware that freshwater is the basis for life here on Earth in California. And groundwater is one of the major ways that people, nature, businesses, farms access that freshwater. And so the importance of what we're talking about today is obviously important to something very specific from a policies perspective, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But it's inherently and crucially important to all of our lives in various ways. So I'm excited to talk to you about kind of the role of SGMA and the role of our organizations in trying to help advance groundwater sustainability. So over the past decades, groundwater management has been unregulated in California, and for many years, the lack of oversight on groundwater pumping led to some pretty significant undesirable impacts in California, including impacts to farms, businesses, communities, nature, and our lands themselves, and the way that these basins were being pumped. And California took a very big step in addressing that problem with the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act back in 2014. And so when that bill was passed, it started this long, in some ways long, in some ways very short in the scheme of time process to bring our most depleted groundwater basins back into balance. So the law was signed in 2014 and started this iterative local planning process that brings us from 2014 all the way to 2040, when local groundwater basins need to achieve a sustainability. And the process to achieve sustainability is being carried out at the local level through the creation of hundreds of groundwater agencies. As Taylor mentioned, these are new local planning and governance agencies that were developed specifically to address groundwater management and sustainability. And one of the first steps for those groundwater agencies was to develop something called the Groundwater Sustainability Plans. And depending on the basin, those groundwater sustainability plans were submitted to the state in 2020 and 2022. And as organizations interested in groundwater sustainability from the perspective of people and nature, a group of NGOs focused on vulnerable groundwater users, such as small farmers, small drinking water communities, and the environment, collectively reviewed all of those plans in 2020 and 2022. That group collectively is known as a Groundwater Leadership Forum. And one thing, by not seeing my notes that I don't have, is the list of all those orgs. So I'm not going to list them in case I miss anybody. But I can maybe one of my teammates can put all that information in the chat for folks to see who engaged in this groundwater review process in 2020 and 2022. And we thought it was really important to review these initial plans for a couple of reasons. The first is it was our kind of first chance to see how groundwater sustainability planning was going from the perspective of the local groundwater agencies and the perspective of these vulnerable groundwater users. And it also was the first time that we are going to see how the state itself kind of responded to the content of these plans and provided input on how agencies were doing and meeting the goals of SGMA. So it was an incredible amount of effort that was done by this group of NGOs, where we read, reviewed, and commented on every single GSA across the state. And we hoped that that would do two things. First, it would provide input to the GSAs on the issues that were important to these organizations, like drinking water, access, and the environment. But it also gave us an incredibly robust data set to pull from to understand, like I said, how SGMA was playing out on the ground. And so through that plan analysis, a couple of products came out of it. The first was an in-depth analysis that was published in Nature Communications that took a look at the connection between how close stakeholders were involved in the GSA planning process and how well they were then protected in the plan itself. So another way of saying that was analyzing how much the needs of certain groundwater users were incorporated into the management decisions that groundwater agencies were laying out in their plans, and whether or not that at all related to how much they were involved in the planning process itself. So and then that paper led to a report. Oh, look there's all the logos. So you guys can see all the organizations. It was right there. A report by the Groundwater Leadership Forum, including Audubon California, California Alliance of Family Farmers, Self-Help Enterprises, Civic Well, Union of Concerned Scientists, Leadership Council, Community Water Center, Clean Water Action, and the Nature Conservancy. Took the output and of that analysis and the findings of that scientific report, that scientific paper, to make some recommendations on how we think we can further achieve groundwater access for all through the SGMA planning process. And we shared those results with the Department of Water Resources, and it was through that kind of information sharing and learning with DWR that we came up with this DWR Technical Assistance Grant process or project that we are in now, which is to take some of the recommendations that we had and try to enact them on the ground with a couple of in a couple of basins, with a couple of GSAs, and with the environmental stakeholders. So as Taylor has outlined, the goal is for us to increase the technical and collaborative capacity of our partners in YOLO and VINA. And so specifically, let's touch base for a second on how GDEs are faring and how these plans are doing in the Sac Valley. The good news is that the basins that we are working in on this effort, their plans were approved by the Department of Water Resources, sending a signal to these GSAs that they're on the right track to meet their sustainability goals in 2040. And the one thing that they did flag, they've got general comments from DWR and some specific comments on their plans and how to improve them over time. And one of the comments that they got related to nature and ecosystems is to better understand the impacts of their management decisions on groundwater dependent ecosystems in their geographies. And that really nicely aligns with some of the things that we found in our own analysis, which is that the protection of GDEs in some of these places they're insufficient when it comes to thinking about long-term sustainability for the ecosystems that rely on it based on the current management plans. And what this does is it sets us up for a really nice opportunity to iterate and collaborate over time to keep these GSAs on the path that they're on towards sustainability, while also improving outcomes for nature, which is the goal of this work. So where we are right now is we are obviously past that 2020, 2022 timeline where we worked on identifying what was happening in the plans themselves. And now we're in this period where we're working directly with some GSAs to ask questions about the protection of GDEs in their plans as of now, and some actions they can take to understand them and to address them moving forward. And we'll be doing that over the next, we've been doing that and doing that over the next year or so, with the goal to bring back recommendations to DWR and to work with all of you. So with that, I want to actually take a moment to pass it to our GSA partners, Sarah and Christina, to take a couple of minutes to talk about why they are engaged in this work and what they are getting out of it.
Who do you want to go first?
You go.
Should I launch in? All right.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christina Buck, Assistant Director at Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation. And we work as staff to a GSA in the Butte Subbasin, and then also provide some kind of technical assistance through our member agency status with two other subbasins, Vina and Wyandotte Creek. So first, just kind of appreciate the opportunity to work with the Nature Conservancy and their team on this. And I think we're really learning a lot from each other, and we'll continue to do that so as we lean into this topic. I think just thinking too about where we've come from, the GSA's had a lot to tackle, and both Caitrin and Taylor acknowledge this. And just remembering that we were all kind of ramping up to get these GSPs together, and then COVID hit too. So that was a challenge when it came to engagement. And it's just good to remember that the world got really weird in the middle of GSP development too. So it's good to, as GSAs now are on kind of the backside of GSP adoption, are really grappling, I think, with the data gaps, that we uncovered, when tasked to manage groundwater, and especially as they relate to groundwater dependent ecosystems, and also kind of tangentially related to that interconnected surface water. And so for the subbasins that I'm working in that have grant dollars, those grant dollars are really leaning into focusing on improvements to the monitoring network and better understanding, how do we better understand these systems and effectively monitor conditions as they relate to things that we care about, such as groundwater dependent ecosystems and also domestic water supplies, those most vulnerable kind of beneficial users to groundwater. So really wanting to recognize the dynamic nature of this. I think we as staff certainly do, and I believe that the GSA board members do as well, recognizing that adoption of the GSP was not the end, but really a new beginning. And so we have a lot of chances to kind of move collectively as we figure out these complexities. What new information do we need? What new policy needs to be set? What decisions need to be made with imperfect information, and how do we move forward with that? And addressing those challenges over time, really beginning in earnest this coming year in 2025. I think I caught it correctly on the poll. One of the responses was 20% maybe of folks on the call were not engaged at all during GSP development. So welcome. I think, it's an exciting and challenging, but really important time to be on this beginning implementation phase. And so as we install some new monitoring wells, but then begin to really open up in some ways the Groundwater Sustainability Plan again with potential amendments, or at least through the periodic evaluation this coming year in 2025. It's a really important time to get engaged. So I will leave it there, and just thanks again for the opportunity to work together.
Great. Sarah, are you here?
Hi, I'm here. You can see me.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Light. I'm a water resources technician for Yolo Subbasin Groundwater Agency. The Yolo Subbasin is about 560,000 acres in Yolo County, California. We submitted our GSP in January 2022 and got approved by DWR in January of this year. Even though the GSP is approved, it has a lot of data gaps and areas for improvement. One of those is consideration of interconnected surface water bodies like Cache and Puda Creeks, and also of groundwater dependent ecosystems. This analysis has been really helpful to us so far. It has helped us connect further with environmental stakeholders that we hadn't been able to reach during the initial GSP process, due to what Christina mentioned. We've been enjoying having technical assistance from the experts. We do a lot of work on groundwater, but not so much on ecosystem health. So it's been really helpful to get that perspective. And understanding better how our current plan helps or does not help the GDEs in our basin, and making a plan together to improve our groundwater sustainability plan through the 2027 periodic evaluation. We've also been able to analyze the groundwater recharge projects we have planned and try and optimize those benefits for environmental users as well. And I'm looking forward to collaborating further on those items with you all.
Thank you both for being here. And I think, Nikolaya,
We are moving on to, we're going to have our first Q&A session now, our moment. And yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective, Christina, and oh my God, Sarah. And so yeah, great to have you here, as was echoed by Caitrin. We have time for questions that are specifically about the program itself, this ecological technical assistance program around GDEs. And we'll get a lot more into the details of GDEs themselves in a little while, but we just wanted to see if people have questions now about the program itself. Any questions? I know we have one in the chat that we could start with.
There's a big one about adjudication, which is probably something I should respond to Lynn offline. It's a bit of a complicated answer, and I can Lynn, I can reach out. separately. I do want to flag that there was a question around where folks can find the comment letters that TNC and other folks submitted, the Groundwater Leadership Forum submitted as part of the SGMA process. And Nick put some information into the chat on how to navigate the SGMA portal to find those comment letters. And that SGMA portal also has has a lot of information. It's got the plans, the approvals, DWR's comments, all those things are located in the SGMA portal. So that's a great place to go to get a little more detail on the status of planning in whatever basin you're interested in.
Right. And just one quick process point. Thank you, Caitrin, is just that any of these more complicated questions, we will address them offline, but we will also be tracking them and providing the response and our notes so that you can kind of track down the question if you also are interested in the answer. So other questions about the program? If not, we are happy to move on because we've got a lot to cover still. And so with that said, I'm happy to introduce Melissa Rohde, who will be presenting on what GDEs are, groundwater dependent ecosystems are, why they matter, and much, much more. So are you ready to go, Melissa? Great.
I am.
You are.
Hi. Can you
Mic
see my
is
screen?
yours. Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here. Nice to see some familiar names and faces. So it's nice to see you all. I am now on a consulting journey and also affiliate adjunct professor at SUNY ESF. And a lot of my work is still around groundwater dependent ecosystems and understanding how they rely on groundwater and how we need to manage groundwater in order to protect them. So to start off, we want to define what a groundwater dependent ecosystem is. And groundwater dependent ecosystems are defined by the California Department of Water Resources as ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or groundwater occurring near the ground surface. And this is, we're talking about groundwater from a principal aquifer, not soil moisture. So it can get a little complicated when you're not like in a clear, large principal unconfined aquifer. There are some instances where you have perch systems that aren't the main pumping aquifer, but they have the capacity to support individual wells. So that's something that needs to be kind of understood locally. But essentially, these ecosystems are incredibly diverse and rely on groundwater in its many expressions across the landscape as it comes into rivers and streams, being able to access it through its plant roots. And so, as you can see here, groundwater and how it interacts with across the landscape can create varying access to groundwater. But we are, the Department of Water Resources defines principal aquifers as aquifers or aquifer systems that store, transmit, and yield significant or economic quantities of groundwater to wells, springs, or surface water systems. And so when we're identifying groundwater dependent ecosystems in the context of SGMA, we need to understand the aquifer structure around these ecosystems and how these ecosystems are connected to these aquifers. As I said, these ecosystems are incredibly diverse. They range from terrestrial forests, such as these. This is a valley oak of riparian forest along the Cosumnes River. We also have valley oak that can provide important shade for rangelands and livestock that are there. They can take the form of springs and seeps. Here's big springs in Mount Shasta. Rivers and streams. So the water itself is aquatic environment, but then also the terrestrial vegetation in these riparian corridors are also critical habitat for riparian birds and other amphibians and small mammals. And then in wetlands. And so from coast to mountains, they are incredibly diverse and across the landscape. And I always like to kind of back up a little bit and put this in context of the larger globe. California is a major global biodiversity hotspot. Anyone that lives here knows that we have an incredible range of habitat. Within, you know, 50 miles driving from coast to inland, you will see a whole range of habitat types, from coastal redwoods to estuarine environments to foothills, oak, so like savanna-like um, um, hills, and then to major rivers and streams, all the way up to mountain meadows, like up in Yosemite. So it's incredibly diverse, and we have a lot of biodiversity. California is a global biodiversity hotspot with incredible species richness. You can see on the right, you can see where by watershed, how many species are in each watershed. But then we also have a lot of threatened and endangered species because, we are home to 40 million people and very large multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry. And so there are a lot of pressures on our habitats, and as a result, we have a lot of critically threatened and endangered species. And so the groundwater-dependent ecosystems that exist today, especially in the Sigma basins, are significantly smaller than when were historically there. And so a lot of them are highly fragmented, and oftentimes the last refugia for threatened and endangered species. And so here's some pictures of some threatened and endangered species that are commonly found in groundwater-dependent ecosystems across California. This was part of an effort that I led when I was at the Nature Conservancy with Audubon and Union of Concerned Scientists, and also, US DFW, and also NOAA. And so they're all, a lot of these ecosystems, when we're doing the Sigma planning, we're looking at polygons and little map features on our GIS systems. But at the end of the day, a lot of times they're hosting really critical habitat that's home to federally and state protected listed species. Okay, so how do you go about identifying groundwater-dependent ecosystems? How do you know? Well, like I said, you need to understand how the principal aquifers are supporting these ecosystems. But there are a whole host of methods, and they vary from high to low certainty, and oftentimes that is associated with cost and even logistic feasibility. So very commonly, not only here in California, but worldwide, scientists will use inference-based approaches. And this allows for more like larger regional mapping efforts and be able to identify ecosystems that are likely dependent on groundwater. And some ways that they do that is to look at see if surface water is present during dry months, especially in Mediterranean climates where we have a distinct wet and dry season. Oftentimes they'll use vegetation species that are known to be phreatophytes, so looking at rooting depth information and also the vegetation mapping. They look at another method is to look at whether or not vegetation remain green or physiologically active during the dry season. And then are water temperatures constant over time, and are groundwater levels near the root zone of plants. And so that requires an understanding of groundwater levels and understanding how groundwater may be connected to habitat. But all of those they're lower on the certainty end, but they give you a pretty good sense of whether or not an ecosystem is likely relying on groundwater. If you really want certainty on if a plant or surface water body has a groundwater connection, the best way to do that is to do an isotopic analysis. And so essentially what you do is you sample the plant or the surface water body of interest and match its isotopic signal with that of rain, of soil moisture, of groundwater nearby. And if it shares the same isotopic signature as groundwater, then groundwater is present. So that is the most direct way to know if groundwater is actually being utilized or supported by an ecosystem. But that is not really logistically feasible to do that across California, across these basins. But it does have it does have a lot of merit in doing these in special places where you want to really confirm and have more certainty. So mapping GDEs across California, this was done in a partnership between the California Department of Water Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Nature Conservancy. And this is a map that was created by inference-based methods. So it uses 48 different data sources, mostly aerial imagery and data sets that map different vegetation types, wetlands, springs, seeps. And so it is intended to be a starting point for GSAs to add or remove polygons that of places that are likely ground dependent. And another mapping effort that we recently released globally for dryland regions of the world. This was an effort with a whole range of folks at the Nature Conservancy, DRI, a bunch of different universities. We essentially mapped ground-dependent ecosystems using remote sensing and machine learning. And this essentially is the blue-green island method, where you look at whether or not things are plants or land are physiologically green or wet during dry periods. So that map is available online now. All the data is downloadable by tiles. The paper was published in Nature. So if you want to read about that, that's available too as well. Okay, so the challenge with a lot of this mapping is that groundwater data is really hard to come by. And when it does exist, it's oftentimes kind of in the middle of the aquifer, whereas a lot of these ecosystems tend to be on the basin boundaries at the intersection of rivers and streams and whatnot. And so well data that we do have is sparse. The well data that we do have oftentimes isn't even accurately monitoring shallow groundwater conditions for these habitats to understand the groundwater fluctuations around that. And then oftentimes, sometimes the data is the well log information is not very clear. So we have some major groundwater data gaps. And then also groundwater is just intrinsically dynamic and complex across the landscape and seasonally. And so there are these natural ebbs and flows. We see them in the winter and the spring when our rivers are running, and then see them dry up in the summer. And these ecosystems, they are adapted to this Mediterranean climate. They will actually need these hydrologic signals, this change to help them fulfill certain key life processes. And so when we're trying to manage groundwater, it's important that we're understanding this range of variability that they need to fulfill their key life processes. And so that is really key for understanding how these ecosystems are reliant on water. And the reliance on groundwater is not only variable in time and space, it also can vary for species. So some species are directly reliant on groundwater and indirectly reliant on groundwater, and that reliance can change over time as well. So to give an example, salmon, for instance, it is not groundwater dependent when it's out at sea, but when it comes up rivers to spawn and relies on cool base flow contributions for spawning, that is a groundwater dependent key life process for that salmon. And then an example of an indirect reliance on groundwater, for instance, is riparian birds like Leesbell's vireo or willow flycatcher that nest in vegetation along streams that are reliant on groundwater through the roots. And so, the bird itself is not groundwater reliant, but if groundwater were to be groundwater access was lost or inaccessible by the plant, then that plant could die back, and then the nesting habitat is gone. And we see there, we have some studies looking at this in the Santa Clara River, for instance, looking at leaf-spills vireo, which is a federally endangered species. So it's complicated, but it doesn't mean that we can't move forward. SGMA is all about adaptive management and trying to move forward with not enough information and then making plans to gain more information to make more decisions. So I'm just going to pause here just to see if anyone has any questions about what an ecosystem is, and then I'll transition into talking a little bit about the impacts of how do we understand the impacts to groundwater-dependent ecosystems.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So, right, this is a pause in Melissa's presentation, and right now I really want to ask clarifying questions about the content that's been presented so far to make sure everybody understands what Melissa's just presented so that we can integrate what comes next. There's been a few questions in the chat that we're going to hold till the end of Melissa's presentation because it will make more sense to answer them after we've gotten some more content. There were a couple of questions, Melissa, about the isotopic signatures. Somebody asked for an example of an isotopic signature that is shared by plants in groundwater.
So generally we use deuterium and O18. We actually have just reviewed a paper I'm a co-author on where we're going to submit a paper for a study that we did for 3 years on the Santa Clara River, looking at the isotopic signature of 5 different plant species like cottonwood and willow, different species along different segments of the river. And then we compared the isotopic signature over multiple seasons to various end member water sources that are nearby. And from that, we were able to identify what times a year certain species were relying on groundwater more than others.
Thank you. There's also a question about the historic relevance in an isotopic analysis, if it could identify areas that were historically GDEs, even if they aren't currently.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these ecosystems are incredibly opportunistic. They will utilize a lot of different types of water. And so I think that's what makes it a little bit complex, is that their use of groundwater can be supplemented, like especially in like river and like riparian habitat, can simultaneously use multiple sources of water, or they can, and then in certain times of year, they can preferentially use others. And so there are certainly GDEs that exist across the state that once used groundwater, but no longer using groundwater, and may or may not be there because they're still using groundwater or other sources of water. And also, too, I just want to add that, oftentimes when you see like a lot of invasives in taking over in groundwater dependent ecosystems, and the groundwater levels are deeper, that's a sign that that ecosystem has basically transitioned away from its natural state because groundwater levels are deeper and invasives are that are able to exist in that low groundwater environment are taking over. But if you were to restore groundwater levels and probably did some invasive removal and revegetation of native vegetation, then you could restore that ecosystem. So yes.
Great, thank you. There's been a couple questions about SGMA that I think we're gonna hold for now. And somebody else asked that you talk more about the implications of uncertain or more direct methods, which I think you're going to get into later on in this presentation. But just to highlight it for you, somebody is curious.
Yeah. The indirect method. I'm a fan of indirect methods. I think it's efficient when you're managing at such a large scale. So there isn't a problem with it, but you have to be comfortable with uncertainty moving forward. And we're going to talk about that in this second half of the presentation.
So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, and we'll get back to the rest of the questions at the end. Yeah.
For your time check, we have about 5 minutes until our next Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so in the at the Nature Conservancy, I led this guidance document, the GDE guidance document, that goes through 5 various steps to how to incorporate these ecosystems into a groundwater sustainability plan. And so ultimately there are, like I said, there can be significant gaps in the NCCAG data set. And so it's up for the local agencies and their consultants to go through and try to delineate anything that might have been omitted because of data gaps in that data set. And Sonoma is a perfect example of this. They had a few polygons from the NCCAG data set because the aerial mapping was not available for the compilation of the NCCAG data set, but then they had their own veg map and that the aerial imagery that they incorporated, and then they populated a whole bunch of polygons that didn't exist. So that's just an example of how agencies can go in and add features, working with other local NGOs and state or federal resource agencies that have a local knowledge of the various habitats throughout the basin is also another way to do that. And anyway, so there's a bunch of different worksheets in this guide associated with this guidance document to use more inference-based approaches to fill in the gaps and to also potentially remove polygons that are less likely to be groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And so the whole identification part of the GDE of the GSP is the first step of the planning. It's in the basin settings section of the plan when you're describing groundwater conditions. But where the real meat, like where the rubber meets the road for sustainability is in quantifying sustainability management criteria that are protective of these ecosystems. And that was largely lacking when we reviewed all the plans, that was largely lacking across the board, across all the GSPs that we reviewed. So it's understanding what are the impacts, what are the groundwater levels that contribute to significant adverse impacts? But that information also has on the side a way to quantify benefits to project when doing project and management actions. And oftentimes, if you know what the ecological thresholds are, then you can even use that information to quantify public benefits or apply for funding that could achieve multiple benefit projects that are benefiting habitat and also water supply for the basin. So understanding ecological thresholds is really key for managing these ecosystems, not only preventing adverse impacts, but also potentially restoring them with multiple benefit projects. And it's important to, when moving forward, it's important to acknowledge that not all GDEs are created equal. There's a whole range of these GDEs across the state. You have some GDEs that are essentially beautiful preserves. They've got a lot of management going on with them. They are in a great, pretty good, decent condition. All the way to the other end of the spectrum where it's just like highly fragmented, like along agricultural ditches. That being said, there, oftentimes can be threatened and endangered species in these environments, but in moving forward, there's so much to do. You have to prioritize where you focus your efforts, especially amidst the data gaps that are existing. And so trying to understand the connection to these various ecosystems and then prioritizing them based on their ecological value is a really key part to prioritizing and moving forward. So what is an impact to an ecosystem? So, like I said, a lot of these Mediterranean plants and animals are capable of withstanding short-term drought or dry periods. But if drought conditions are prolonged or even wet conditions, they can actually experience a significant adverse impacts where you have this like negative feedback cycle where things just kind of spiral out of control. And I would say the two, you can either have reproduced reproduction or just like a whole collapse. And so that threshold response, like how the ecosystem transitions, varies by the type of plants, vegetation and aquatic habitats that are there, the other types of water that are available, and then the relative change, the rate of change in groundwater conditions and the absolute change in groundwater conditions has an effect on the consequences that we see in these habitats. So to give an example, there's two basically types of ecosystem impacts. There's acute impacts and there's chronic impacts. So think of it like an acute impact is like, a heart attack, like you get it and sometimes you die. Whereas like a chronic impact is something like Alzheimer's. It's like a slow onset. And so we have observed various types of adverse impacts across the state in these ecosystems over the last few droughts. In 2012 to 2016, on the left, you can see, this was the image from 2016, I believe. It is a nature conservancy property along the Santa Clara River, and 500 acres of riparian habitat just died off because they lost access to groundwater. And there's actual science that's shown this with remote sensing work that was done, isotopic analyses that were done, dendrochronology studies, and I can provide links to that work that confirms that it was actually groundwater, lack of access to groundwater that led to this widespread mortality event. On the right, we have a more chronic impact. This is another Nature Conservancy property along the Cosumnes River. It's Valley Oak riparian habitat, and while everything looks quite nice for a picnic, when you look in the understory, you recognize that there is no understory, and that's because groundwater levels are too deep for saplings to regenerate. And so this is more of a chronic impact where we are seeing an adverse impact is underway, but we can't really tell because, on first glance. But it is occurring because there is no replenishment or regeneration that can occur with groundwater levels this deep. So that's an adverse impact. So in future workshops, we'll dive into more of the threshold analysis work that I led that was published in Nature Water. But that work essentially uses the last droughts as a way to look back and say, okay, what were the groundwater levels or the regime shifts that caused these habitats to experience a significant adverse impact? And so satellite imagery has given us a really amazing tool to go back in time and understand what are the conditions that cause these impacts. So I just want to leave it at this. It's really important that amidst uncertainty that we're taking preventative action rather than reactive action. And I mean, Sigma in some ways is a reactive situation where we, have had situations of chronic depletion of groundwater, and we're coming in, and it's really hard to try to bring things back, the basins back into the balance because we let things go past what they're supposed to. And so, same with habitats. Once you reach these critical thresholds, it is really hard to manage the ecosystem function. You are having to spend a lot of money, a lot of effort, moving individual fish across, the rivers. It's really important to think about how can we manage groundwater so that the hydrologic regime is the habitats are able to manage themselves within their own hydrologic regime. And so prevention is better than being reactive. And I think we will leave it at that. That loop was making me a little dizzy. Here I am.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. This is great. We have a lot of questions.
Great.
We've got actually about six of them. One we're going to actually have Taylor address, but the first one I actually put in the chat because it's a little longer. So if I can see, that's from Marty. It's the most recent chat question here. It says a conundrum has emerged. Maybe best for you to read that rather than me reciting it.
If the projected drawdowns are below the GDE levels, maybe can you come on and explain this? I don't know what you mean by GDE levels. You mean groundwater levels or groundwater dependent ecosystem rooting depth? What do you mean by GDE levels?
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, in our area, we have our water table is typically 30 to 50 feet historically below the ground level. And the minimum thresholds that have been identified for our GSP is at 150 feet. And I have been told that the if the ground level water, the levels are so low that they are beyond where the GDEs will be able to access them, then they are taken out of the equation, that they then become not part of the concern because it's too far away.
Yeah, so in the GDE guidance document, we were promoting like an inference approach of using the rooting depth to assess a connection to groundwater. So like, is groundwater within 30 feet of a habitat in order, to verify that it's likely to rely on groundwater. That was an inference-based um, method that we were promoting. The challenge with that is that you need to have really good shallow groundwater data around these ecosystems to do that. And one of the things that that commonly happens is that we don't have good enough data around these. And so you have to use that 30-foot threshold. And we also said 80-foot for Valley Oak because it's unclear that in the literature what the actual rooting depth is of that species. But yeah, if it is deeper than ground, if the groundwater levels are way below the root zone, then the assumption is that it's basically disconnected. And so that's something that, has to be, analysis that needs to be taken with care and understanding how good the groundwater data is that you're using to do that. And if you're unsure, you keep it in and assume it's connected and then assess potential impacts.
Great. Okay, we've got a bunch more questions. And unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to them because we're running short on time. So I'm taking them in the order that they've come in. We will again address these offline as well through print and maybe a separate conversation. So a little more, I think, straightforward one from Adam. How does Sigma address GDEs related to artesian springs?
Sorry, can you say it again? How does
Yeah,
Sigma?
how does Sigma address GDEs related to artesian springs?
If there's an artesian spring in a basin, then it could be mapped in the NCCAG database, but if it isn't, then it would need to be added by the GSP.
Okay. Great. Next is question from a couple of folks. Does Sigma address species that use the Vado zone?
Okay, so the Vado zone is essentially it's the unsaturated area above the saturated zone. And where things get complicated is that plants actually don't like their roots submerged in groundwater. They are using capillary action through the Vado zone from the phreatic zone, from groundwater, the aquifer, to pull water up. There's actually studies that have shown that phreatophytes will elongate their roots to chase deeper groundwater levels in the summer and retract them in the wetter periods when groundwater levels rise. So they never have their feet, so to speak, their roots submerged in groundwater itself. So they will be operating in the Vado zone, but it's the capillary rise of groundwater from the principal aquifer that you need to be looking at. And that's where it gets a little complicated because the water levels are going to be deeper than the root zone. Rooting zones, the rooting depth changes by species. And so, and the capillary fringe is a factor of the soil media. So if it's coarser sediments versus clay, the thickness of that will vary.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions, but we need to keep moving, unfortunately, otherwise we're going to compromise the other sections. So I think we just have to hold these questions. There's some really good ones from Jeremy, Jim, Patrizia, and others. So we're going to, they will be addressed, just not live in the moment right now, unfortunately. And Melissa, just on this point, folks can contact you.
I'll put my email in the chat.
In the mail and chat. Okay, great. Awesome. And of course, others on the team, that email will be also available. Others' emails will be available too. Okay. So there is one question that related to Taylor. We're going to hand it over to you to talk about what's next for stakeholder engagement. But one related question to that is how this project is addressing tribal engagement.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have talked with our GSA partners about getting tribes involved. And in some cases, it may or may not be of interest to them. For the outreach workshops, we have been talking with a group where there might be some tribal engagement. But again, because we don't have those relationships directly ourselves, we're relying on our partners and local partners to kind of be the conduit for encouraging more tribal engagement. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that person just had to get off the call, but we'll definitely track this one. So yeah, it's over to you, Caitlin. I'm sorry, Taylor, for the next steps around engagement.
Sure, let me share my screen real quick. Okay, you can see the slide. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so just to give a little bit more detail on what kind of timeline we're looking at moving forward into the new year. So the first part of our outreach is complete for the most part. As I mentioned, we'd spent this year identifying stakeholders who are interested in engaging and conducting these initial interviews. Through those, we identified different technical, governance, and outreach challenges and opportunities that we're going to bring into the outreach events. So today we're doing the webinar, and the point of the webinar again was to kind of cover these foundational knowledge gaps, and then that's really in preparation for the outreach workshops. So moving into the new year, and this will be about spring 2025. We don't have exact dates yet, but the workshops will be targeted for groups who are local to the Yolo, Vina, and Butte subbasins. So these workshops are going to focus on connecting the data to on-the-ground project and planning efforts. And I've seen some questions in the chat that I think will be really well suited to covering some of these together in the workshop. So we're definitely going to keep these in mind. We're also going to focus on the ways in the workshop that we can help strengthen collaborative capacity for the GSA and environmental stakeholders moving forward. And that might be through identifying potential projects that bring some of this data to the ground, and if there are any touch points where people can really stay involved strongly through the next 5 to 10 years or so. And then by the end of 2025, we're going to be completing our final reporting. So as I mentioned previously, that'll focus on opportunities for DWR to support this process moving forward. So that's the timeline. With that, I think we're going to wrap up our presentations and then maybe I'll turn it over to Ag Innovations. I know we have a final poll and then we can do some more questions.
Thanks, Taylor. Add myself so you can see me. Hi again. So now that we've covered all of the content, the GDE presentation, and a broad brush of stakeholder engagement, what has happened and what will happen, we have another moment for question and answer. That's really, any lingering questions. And I'll include the ones that have come before. I'm just scrolling. So we have a question here. This is probably for you, Melissa. When you're looking at remote sensing data, the greenness from remote sensing data, this is a question from Jeremy. How do you differentiate between vegetation that's staying green due to groundwater or that's staying green because of residual soil moisture or drought tolerance?
Yeah, I mean, you can't unless you have groundwater data. And so when we're like the mapping effort that we did globally, we didn't have groundwater data, but we used other proxies to help infer that groundwater was likely present. So we use land surface temperature anomalies. So like if groundwater is coming to the surface, you'll see basically the land surface stay cooler than in an adjacent area. And then yeah, other information on like different plant types and their rooting depth. So, I mean, that's the challenge with all this stuff, is that you need good groundwater data. And so moving forward, the question is like, yeah, how do we enhance our monitoring of these ecosystems? And then the challenge is that even if we had like $1 trillion and we put in wells everywhere, we would only have data starting from today, right? And so it's hard to, then we would have to wait for a period of time to get an understanding of the conditions that are happening. And so, you know, not saying that we shouldn't enhance our well network, but you know, there might be other remote sensing approaches that could help kind of fill in our understanding of past groundwater conditions. But this is like a whole area of research that's being undergoing right now.
Thank you. There was a question from Jim that is actually a multi-tiered question, so I'm going to send it to you right now so you can read it. And while you're reading and processing that, Caitrin, do you want to talk about the definition of sustainability and where it was when SGMA was passed and where it is now?
Yeah, there was a question about the definition of groundwater sustainability in SGMA and using 2015 as the baseline of sustainability, and what are we really kind of stuck in that? And I think the question that they're asking is like, can we be using SGMA to drive essentially recovery of groundwater levels beyond that 2015 baseline, or for ecosystems that maybe didn't exist in 2015? I'm reading between the lines that might be the question they're asking. And the answer is that SGMA does require, within the planning and within all of the management that needs to happen, a definition of sustainability based on a 2015 baseline. So when it comes to what SGMA will be driving from a regulatory standpoint, we should expect that they'll be trying to avoid additional impact beyond what was happening in 2015, and impact to drinking water, subsidence, people, nature, all those things. So it doesn't require recovery to conditions before that time, but there are likely other planning and management processes locally that could be focused on recovery that SGMA isn't. And so I think it's been brought up a couple times today that while SGMA is one big driver of kind of land use and water planning happening across our landscape, if we're thinking about recovery of either an ecosystem or a species that has been degrading over time and 2015 baseline isn't the right one, then there might be other processes to engage in, including processes related to like endangered species recovery and so forth. So there is that's one thing that we have to keep in mind in what we're tasked to do under SGMA.
Thank you, Caitrin. And our last question for now, Melissa, do you want to address Jim's question?
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, oak species do hydraulically lift groundwater, and it can benefit saplings and other shallow-rooted plants. However, at some point, the groundwater levels can become too deep that we don't see this happening anymore. And I'm about to hit enter on a chat here with the link to a paper that you can read more about that. And then in regards to acute impacts, so there's the impacts that occurred on the Santa Clara River, which you saw from the video. The research has shown it was basically an absolute groundwater level of like 4 or 5 meters. Once that groundwater level was hit, then we start seeing precipitous decline or mortality. And then a rate of change in groundwater levels was 0.5 meters per year. So I'm going to put that link, the chat here, and then the other one is from Kibler, and I'll put that in as well. There you go. There it is. And those studies kind of are on the Santa Clara River, but I want to point out that a lot of these species are cottonwood and willow, and are the most prevalent in the NCCAG dataset. And just a side note, the reason why oftentimes people, I'm talking about plants a lot and not stream flow and things like that, is that plants are really a great, essentially, they're like pseudo wells. And so since they're a lot of times they're accessing groundwater through their root system, when we can and we can detect how they're doing with remote sensing data sets, it gives us an opportunity to kind of track how these ecosystems are doing at large scale. And so, you know, understanding their health is important for understanding aquatic health and also terrestrial health. Okay, and then here's the second paper that talks about the acute impacts.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so everyone knows we will send a follow-up that includes these links, and we're capturing the questions that we're not able to answer now, and we'll do our best to answer them in other formats, whether it's at the on-site workshops, in writing, or just via personal reach out. So you can continue to let us know if you have additional questions in the chat, and they will get captured. And now we're going to go into a few closing polls. One is seeking feedback on this webinar, and then we also want your input to gauge what else you want to understand about GDEs and the next moves of this technical assistance team going forward to support everyone involved. Yeah, so Robert, you want to go ahead and launch those polls?
Yes, here we go. Everyone can see those to make sure we're good. There's 3 questions.
Thank you. And for those answering other to questions 2 and 3, please do put your thoughts in the chat. About half of the folks here have participated, so we're going to leave it open for another minute or so. Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds. Please put your answers in if you have not already.
Okay, looks like it's, yeah, input is slowing down. Can we stop here?
Yeah.
Nicolaya? Yeah, okay. Sorry to those that are mid process, but it's slowing down a lot. Okay, here are the results.
Thank you all for those who filled this out. And it's really helpful. I just want to say we really appreciate it because it helps us make sure that our work is most helpful to you all. And especially I do appreciate the folks who are elaborating on their answers to other in the chat. And I want to ask if you have a moment to look over this to the other webinar team members. If there's anything that you're curious about or that surprises you, high-level observations, just seeing these answers at broad brush that you want to share.
I just think we're getting some really great engagement and really great follow-up questions. So I really appreciate everyone's thoughts, and especially it seems like we're building on the content here to some really great future questions around how to determine groundwater ecological thresholds, how to connect what we're doing here with what's happening with other aspects of SGMA, such as in-stream flow depletion, or how to think about the connection between projects like recharge projects and GDE protection. So I think it's a good sign that we are starting a good future conversation. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I second what Caitrin said, and just thinking through looking at the chat and the poll results about how we can really take what we're learning today and apply it to our outreach workshops, and making sure that folks are feeling like they're getting the most value and benefit from the outreach workshops as possible, and bringing some of this stuff to the ground and diving a little deeper, even more into assessing impacts to GDEs and learning about analyses that are in the GSP. So I'm really looking forward to the workshop.
That's great. Thank you all. So we actually we have one more question for you. Thank you for answering these questions for us. And it's Robert will launch it in a moment. It's a short answer question, so you can write your words down. And Aurelia, we are also interested in how to support coordination with GDs getting more integrated into the GSPs. So this last question will help us do that better. Thanks to everyone putting in their answers. You all can't see, but I can see people are participating. We really appreciate it. You can continue to write your answers. We'll keep this poll open for another couple minutes as we close. And as people are putting in their answers, I also want to turn it over to Caitrin and Taylor to close us out and let us know what the next steps are.
Taylor, I think this is you. Thank you,
Yes, it
everybody.
is.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you everybody for attending today. And again, like in preparation for the outreach workshops, I'll be reaching out to folks who I interviewed the first time around, maybe to get a little bit more detailed information. I've gone back and forth a little bit with folks in the chat, but if you have other people in the Yolo, Butte, and Vina areas that would be useful for us to talk to, especially regarding this potential around local projects and then really bringing the data to the ground, please do feel free to reach out to me via email. I popped my email into the chat, and other just general questions about our outreach, please feel free. For folks that are here, I also have many people's emails, and it comes time to do the outreach workshops, I'll be reaching out to people who I out to already, and then expand from and go from there. So we will be in touch.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate everyone's time and hope everyone has a great rest of their week and holiday season.
Yes, hope everybody has a restful break.
Indeed. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
We'll keep the poll open for a bit more too, if you need to answer it still. I think we are done.
I'm on mute. Yes, Patricia, we are going to send out the poll results.